Hear the beat and feel the flow. Pop it, lock it, drop it low. Hey, and welcome to D Infinity Live, the multi-platform, multi-publisher, multi-host online tabletop gaming supplement. I'm your host, William Big T Thrasher. With me, as always, are your other hosts, Michael Jolly Varhola and Brendan Cass. And joining us once again, very, very good friend of the show, Clint Staples.
Hey.
How y'all doing?
A staple of the show, we might say.
Oh, that hurts.
That'll do it.
One of our staples.
Just keep them coming, Mike.
All right, so here's what we're going to do. We'll have some horrible puns for all of our names next time, and we'll just do a whole pun-based episode.
Actually, I've been wondering, Will, can we do like a running blog post at D Infinity Online that has all of your little poems from the beginning of each show? Why aren't we doing that?
We probably could. I'll have to go back and transcribe a few because a handful were improvised.
I could probably combine them into 1 hour-long video of all of the intro.
You know, that would be awesome. It would be our first D Infinity Live supercut.
It would.
Yep.
Well, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, our topic is field work, getting your hands dirty while doing research both for and within tabletop games. But before we do that, we've got a lot of things going on. First and foremost, Brendan, what is going on our website, d-infinity.net?
Well, we have first a blog post by Chris Van Deelen, which is a list of his top 5 sci-fi novels. So if you're looking for a new book to read and you like the sci-fi genre, check that one out. He's got a good eye for these things. He's a big sci-fi fan and owns his own set of armor.
Klingon batlets.
For all these other, yeah, that sort of thing. So probably trust his opinion. You and Clint sort of went back and forth a little bit with the concept of food in fantasy games, which is something that's often neglected, and it actually will spice up your games if you include mentions of it. We've got Oddities for a Stable, which is our next series of oddities. A few practical magic spells, which has been a handy running theme series of spells that have probably more utility outside of combat than within. But you know, if you're clever enough, why not use them in both? And then Clint, you've been posting pretty regularly about your Knights Marshall camp. Since you're here, I won't talk about it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's been going on with that campaign setting? It seems to be very well received.
It's been getting a certain amount of buzz and response, so that's always nice. So I've been working on background and the races of the Commonwealth and technology and stuff like that, and fitting it all into the Bash sci-fi game system. Although I'll be writing some new rules for that as well to make it fit with my vision of the Commonwealth and the people in it. So some alternate rules and just some things that are sort of setting specific. So, but it's sort of an anachronistic space fantasy sci-fi kind of thing. So harkening back to games that I've really enjoyed in the genre, like Fading Suns and stuff like that, where it's not super technical. A lot of the people that use the items are really not aware of how they function, and so it's a bit like almost like Dark Ages in outer space. So.
Well, I think people will appreciate those things. I remember you mentioning that the people who work on the technology treat it more like a religious ritual than a science when they construct these things. Right,
it's sort of one and the same. So you know, they might be aware that yes, you have to tighten those gears to make that mech arm work, you know, track correctly. But you also need to anoint it with specially sacred oils and you know, say a prayer over it at the same time. Otherwise, the spirits that inhabit that mech just aren't going to be happy. You know,
it's been pretty cool watching it sort of grow organically in your posts on D Infinity. So For people who are interested in that campaign setting, Clint's been posting about it regularly, and it's a kind of behind-the-scenes view of what will no doubt be a very cool completed campaign setting when Clint's done with it.
And I believe the plan is for us to come out with those as a series of shorter PDFs that will eventually combine into a complete book. So
Right.
people won't have to wait for a single 150-page manual. They'll get it, 20 or 30 pages at a time. So hopefully they can get up and running a little faster if they want.
And that's the formula that we really stumbled on with our City Builder books.
Yeah.
We did 11 volumes of City Builder. We released them over the course of a year, and people responded really well to that. And some people only wanted specific volumes. They only wanted 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of the volumes. And then we consolidated it all into a book at the end of a year after we had run them anyway, and some people wanted that. So it's really a very user-friendly model, and one that we kind of stumbled on but have made the most of since then.
Sorry, minor meltdown.
Only my. It was merely a 3-mile island. It was not a Chernobyl.
Right.
Excellent.
Very
And then, any other news from d-infinity.net? I will take that as a no.
No, I'm working on some neat things, but I don't want to talk about it on next show when I've actually got something to show for it.
I see. Well, Mike, what's been going on with our co-publisher Skirmisher?
Well, we have a new release out this week. It is Wisdom from the Wastelands, issue number 49, Super Science Artifacts 5. Unique Super Science Artifacts 5. So these are one-of-a-kind artifacts. And the fact that it's the 5th in a series should not dissuade anyone from checking it out if they think the contents sound cool, because these are all self-standing. And Wisdom from the Wastelands, who anyone doesn't know, is a mini supplement, a 5-page supplement that is licensed for Mutant Future, and Mutant Future is a retro clone of Gamma World. So, in short, Wisdom from the Wastelands is useful for Mutant Future or Gamma World, or in many cases for any kind of sci-fi or modern or post-apocalyptic game, because a lot of the stuff is stat-free or stat-light. So we just released that this week. I recommend people check that out. Since our last show, we have released an MP3 download of last week's show. So anyone who wants to re-listen to the show or wants to listen to it rather than watch it can download that from DriveThruRPG. And we just added today a video to our listing for Little Orc Wars. So Little Orc Wars is a miniatures game that we publish. H.G. Wells's Little Orc Wars, I should call it, because essentially what we did is we took H.G. Wells's Little Wars rules from 1913 and we turned them into a fantasy variant. So it's a game where almost all combat is resolved with live catapult fire. It can use any miniatures. It can use any kind of projectile throwers. And the video we added is one that Brendan put together for us, which is really pretty cool because it shows a pretty lively Little Orc Wars game being played in an office lunchroom with projectile throwers made from office supplies. So it's not the only way the game can be played, but it's one way the game can be played. And I'd encourage people to check out Little Orc Wars. It's a great miniatures game. And check out the video. Go to DriveThruRPG. We're adding videos almost every week to our listings. And apropos of Little Orc Wars, I'm going to ask Brendan to announce something that he and I were just discussing today. I don't mean to put you on the spot, Brendan, but this is kind of cool. It's a first for Skirmisher, and I'd like people to be able to say they heard it first here.
Sure. Well, a buddy and I, goes by the name Sam Classens. He is a fellow software developer. We're working on Little Orc Wars, the video game. So you will be able to bring that up on your mobile device and with your finger drag back the arm of your rubber band powered catapult to fling dice at the miniatures of your opponent. and it'll capture all of the essence of the Little Orc Wars floor game, all of the randomness that you get from a physics-based war game, and all of the quirky cheats you get from H.G. Wells's original Little Wars, full of milk cartons becoming fortifications and so on. So, working on a game jam for that this weekend. We'll have a prototype for it, and we're shooting to have something that people can play by the time Comic Palooza rolls around.
And that is last weekend of May. And
correct.
We are getting ready for that right now.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Well, that's good news to hear. Well, moving on to our main topic, that is fieldwork. And tonight we're going to be looking at fieldwork from two different but very closely related angles. One being fieldwork that you do outside of a game to prep for a game, and fieldwork that you actually do as part of the game. And that's something I'm very well acquainted with. I run a lot of investigative games. But before we really dig into that, I just wanted to go around the room and get everybody's general impression of fieldwork. Clint, why don't we have you start?
You mean how would I define it?
How would you define it, or what's your general impression of it?
Okay, well, I mean, I think there's nothing better than doing field work if you've got the time to invest. But as far as how I would define it, I guess pretty much any kind of research that doesn't involve reading about it, for me, qualifies as field work. If your field work is digital field work, that's still field work as far as I'm concerned. Google Maps and other things like that are perfectly fine, and in fact a really good tool, especially for modern games or games set in a historical period or a fantasy version of a historical period, like say the Coast setting or something like that.
Right.
I know when I've been writing fiction for Coast, it's been really handy to be able to go on Google Maps and look at a close-up map of Coast Island and Coast City and go, oh yeah, it's like 4 miles to the Anatolian mainland and stuff like that. So it's actually a swimmable distance if you're in good shape or desperate or both. Yeah. So stuff like that. So
well, you'd be surprised.
There's nothing better than doing field research if you can.
So you'd be surprised how far you can swim when there are sharks chasing you.
Absolutely. Or in the case of my hero Arabaj, a bunch of hobgoblins from the Tetrarchy. But they're sort of like sharks with fingers and swords. So
cool. And how about you, Brendan?
Well, it's funny that Clint mentioned the Anatolian boom to it. Mike and I, and I won't take all of this story because Mike was there too. But
I've got other stories. You take as much of it as you want. Take as much of it as you want, because I've got plenty of stuff.
Sure. Well, we went to Kos, and while what Clint says is absolutely true. In fact, people who are interested in measuring distances easily in Google Maps, right-click on the map, click Start Measuring Distance from here, click on the other point, and it'll bring up a little ruler on the Google map of how far things are, and that way you don't actually have to hold your thumb out and look at the little scale at the bottom to see how big things are, which is something that I use all the time, actually, because I use Google Maps quite frequently. One of the adventures I wrote takes place on a fish shape scrolled around in the Aegean looking for exactly an island that looks like a fish, and found one. Could only do that by researching things. And it looks uncannily like a fish, so it was perfect.
And it was right where we needed it to be, too, which is even more perfect.
Right, exactly. So, research, especially for all of my games, is really important. Usually, all of my sessions will spring out from one research fact that I thought was particularly interesting. I know I share links regularly with the people I develop games with interesting things. I recently read about a tree called the Gimpy tree, which has a sting that's so painful to die and people to commit suicide. So that right there is a plot device that you can use in an adventure. Or there was an article I read about a forest that had grown up in grown in a battlefield, or what was a World War I battlefield, and the trees had weapons embedded inside of them. So that was pretty cool too, and this could be the source of an adventure. So yeah, whether you're there physically or just reading, interesting articles, there's a lot of places where you can find inspiration and incorporate into your game. Because real life, is more often than not more creative than you are, just because there's so much of it.
And how about you, Mike?
Well, I vary a little from Brendan and Clint on this. To me, field work means getting off your butt and going outside. And it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with how far you go. So, if I put on my backpack and I go outside and I hike the deer trails for 45 minutes, well, that's field work. Because when I go into clearings and I see these weird little circles of standing stones, or weird patterns of cactuses in the spring and summer, or some plant that I've never seen, or a cactus growing out of a tree, which I see, any weird stuff like that, to me, this is all, as they were saying, inspirational, or gives you a better sense of how the world works. But to me, and I do use Google Maps extensively, and I do read nonfiction works as tie-in for all of my game development. But to me, that's research, and research and field work are different animals. So, I travel a lot. Anyone who followed my travel blog over the summer knows that I spent a month in the Aegean and did a lot of research for the Swords of Kos fantasy campaign setting on Kos and Crete and Santorini. That's field work. But not everybody can or wants to do that. But I'd say the minimum standard is, getting out of your chair. I don't think you can do field work from your chair unless you're someone who's confined to a wheelchair, and then you can go outside and still do field work. But I would say that for me, field work means getting up, going out, doing something, as opposed to research, which is equally valuable, but a different thing.
Yeah, I suppose in my own experience, I tend to define fieldwork as getting your hands dirty with the act of research, whether that means actually getting outside, getting away from the normal area you're used to working in,
right?
Or in my case, I've got all these reference books that I have in the basement, simply because there's not enough room in the rest of the house for them. So, like, for me, field work can be going down to the basement for an hour and going through boxes and getting covered in dust and cobwebs and
like I said, I think that's legitimate because it's research. But the word field implies being away from the home base. By definition, field work implies. So, I don't know, is going to library field work? Once again, I would say that's research. Even there's a fine line. Going to a museum is research. Going to a museum on the island of Rhodes, well, that's research and field work. So I think that, like you said, there's got to be an element of getting your hands dirty, and not just dirty because the boxes in your basement are dusty.
Well, there's some unique filth that we have cultivated down there, but that's a story for another time. All right. Oh, what was that, Clint?
I didn't say anything, but I will.
I'm sorry.
One of the things that I would like to add to that, because I know what you're saying, Mike, and I agree to an extent, but I think that there, as you were pointing out, there is sort of a gray area in the middle, and one of the things that I constitute as research is hands-on, as you put it, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean you have to get out of your chair.
Okay, true enough.
Or out of your house. But I do a certain amount of historical reconstructions of things.
That's right, you make things, yeah.
I make things. I have period reproductions of armor and weapons and clothing and other things like that. So those things I find very useful and very informative. And a lot of them, other than going out to the store to go and buy materials or going to somewhere else to make the item, a lot of the activity of it is done, sitting in front of my computer or something like that, comparing it to research that I'm reading.
That's right, and I'd say that is a very legitimate gray area thing. You're absolutely right. Reading about armor or weapons, I would say, is purely research. But then when you actually start taking a real weapon or real armor or constructing it or trying it on or using it or whatever, yeah, sure, that is crossing into actual.
It's the difference between first person and secondary experience. Right? Are you experiencing this information through somebody else's experience that has been written down or recorded it in some way? Or are you making these things? Or are you going to these places and experiencing it firsthand? And Clint, was it you that served on a Viking longship?
I think served is too strong a word, but I did row one for an hour. When I was in,
were you press ganged?
No, we
no
actually.
one serves on a Viking longship. They're enslaved on a Viking longship. They're not servants, Brendan.
Paid for the privilege, actually. But no, it was awesome. We were in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, which, if anybody cares, is probably the body of water that Beowulf would have sailed along or rowed into to go to Hrothgar's hall at Heorot. So we thought that was wicked cool to begin with. But they have a Viking ship museum there with several reconstructions and the originals for 7 or 8 Viking ships that they pulled up out of the harbor there. And so we got to row a Viking ship and sail a Viking ship for about an hour around the Roskilde Fjord, and it was awesome. It was very interesting. And so much easier than I thought it was going to be. So
that says a lot for you. Rowing on a bank of oars was easier than I thought it would be. That's pretty hardcore.
My other experience with rowing is on a rowing machine at the gym or that kind of thing, where you're putting way more weight on yourself than you are when you're rowing a ship. Even to get the ship moving, right? Where you've got the full resistance of the ship in the water. And all of us rowing very poorly, I might add, because we're all a bunch of tyros who have never rowed a ship before and certainly never worked as a crew together. So oars were going all over the place, and it was funny and embarrassing. And the guy who was the captain of the ship was sort of smirking into his beard. But we got the ship going, and once it was moving, the oar was almost weightless in your hand. It was very interesting, and we were clipping along, the captain said, at about 7 knots, purely on oar power, which is
pretty good.
That's very fast. And then we got the sail up, and we were making about the same amount of speed that way. So
I mean, 7 knots. That's like what, 2.5 times faster than most people walk.
I think that's about 10 miles an hour.
Yeah. It's a little bit less than double. The knot in miles an hour. It's a little bit less than double.
It's 1.1, isn't it? So that would be like 7.7 miles an hour, I think.
Is that what it is? Okay.
Yeah.
No,
it was a lot less than double.
So, and I never would have been able to imagine that any other way than actually getting on the ship and doing it. So I found it very cool. So.
I think that's a perfect example. I think, Clint, that's almost like a quintessential example of empirically learning something from fieldwork. I mean, that's so great, especially from the point of view of game development. I mean, what's more iconic than a Viking longship?
Well, and for a lot of things, especially for writing or for gaming, it's all in the little details.
That's right.
Really. So, for example, my son and I had noticed that when we were on our cruise ship that we had seen a lot of jellyfish in the water. We were wondering what they were because they looked like softballs floating underneath the water.
They do.
And so we finally realized they were jellyfish, and we were talking because we saw them when we were on the Viking ship, and we asked the captain, and he said, "Oh yeah, those are all over the place here. The ones outside of Roskilde Fjord are poisonous. If they sting you, it's like getting stung by a wasp. But the ones here are not." He says they look identical, but the ones in Roskilde Fjord, they don't have a sting that hurts people. So here they have kids that will pick them up and carry them home and stuff like that and scare the crap out of their moms and that kind of thing. But anywhere else in the Baltic, apparently, if you pick one up, you're going to get a very red, painful hand. So
interesting. Huh, that's kind of weird.
The water in Roskilde Fjord only changes when the wind comes from a certain direction, because it's like a giant bathtub. The water goes in, and unless the wind moves the water across the mouth of the fjord, the water doesn't come out again. So
well, you know what?
It can stay there for weeks if the wind is going in the wrong direction, and it can get really foul, apparently.
Well, what you're saying about details like that is being critical in game design or fiction writing, for that matter, story writing. That's all absolutely correct. And some of the places that I've most enjoyed writing about are just like that, Clint. Places I've gone and I've discovered some little thing that I've only discovered because I went there, because I happen to be the person who was boots on the ground. And that's not to say I necessarily take that very place and adapt it into a story, but I'll take that experience and extrapolate it into a scene from a story or an encounter area for an adventure or whatever.
Sure.
You're right, Mike, and it reminds me all of this trip, and this is nearby. So we've talked about exotic places, Greece, or rowing Viking ships and all that. But I stopped by Scranton, Pennsylvania, and I visited a lace factory there, or what used to be a lace factory there. Now, Scranton, Pennsylvania is not an exotic location, so this just goes to show you that it doesn't matter where you are. There are usually little things that you can learn about. So this abandoned lace factory, this is something I learned just by going inside of it, was the absolute center of this community. Inside of it, there was a bowling alley, there was a basketball court, there was a little theater where people could put on plays, where people not only went to work, ate some of their meals during the day, maybe multiple meals during the day, but it's also where they went for entertainment. And so when this factory shut down because they lost business, couldn't compete with China, the soul and heart of this little town in Pennsylvania died.
Interesting.
But that workplace being the center of a community like that isn't something I had ever seen or experienced, working in corporate America, for example. Never would have expected that. Those old school factories, completely different from the way things are now. And I would only have ever learned about that from having gone to see it, because usually it's just one of those small things that people wouldn't have mentioned by someone writing about outsourcing. It never would have been written by an anthropologist that wanted to bring up something about the theater or the bowling alley or anything like that. But those are little details that end up becoming very valuable.
Well, and certainly when you're talking about a fantasy campaign setting or a science fiction setting where you might have alien peoples or whatever, too often you see the same tropes repeated again and again. Every village in some fantasy campaign settings are really pretty all much the same. There's a tavern, and there's a stockade, and there's a wall. And a lot of my towns are set up just like that, because that's actually how some towns really are set up. But the example you're giving, Brendan, is really kind of brilliant, because it really, even if you don't use what you learned as a model for a campaign setting, what it does is it makes you stop and say, all communities are not constituted the same. The idea that you'd have these recreational and day-to-day facilities inside this factory area, that's pretty fascinating, and something that very well might not occur to somebody. You know, we think in terms of commuting from a place that we live to a place where we work, and all these different things that were consolidated there being in separate places. So just conceiving of how things can be different, I think, is very important.
Yeah, and it makes you you know, mindful of things you might not have really been aware of before. You know, as Brendan mentioned with that that silk factory, you know, communities are built around something. You know, what resource attracted people there to begin with? What resource, what industry, what feature of the environment? And you know, and that's something that you're really not gonna think about unless you're out there and you're seeing the way that can the resources can build a community. And I was curious, actually, what are some ways that fieldwork have specifically influenced your game design?
Good question.
Well, I got one. For my RuneQuest campaign, which is set in the River of Cradles, which, according to rules as written, is filled with all kinds of dinosaurs, which I think dinosaurs are cool, but I didn't want to do dinosaurs. So when I was stalking my River of Cradles, I didn't know what I was going to do. And coincidentally, we went on a family trip to the Badlands in South Dakota and went to something called the Mammoth Site, which is an active dig they found, I think it's 27 complete mammoth carcasses so far, as well as a number of other things like cave bears and smilodons and some other smaller creatures. And it's an active dig. So while we were there were archaeologists and stuff sitting in the holes with little spatulas and brushes and stuff like that, working away. And they would talk to you if you had questions and that kind of stuff. And apparently they've done soundings, and it goes down further. They're, I think, at 36 feet below grade right now, and the soundings mean that the site goes down another 60 feet before they run out of fossils. So they've got a long way to go.
That's amazing.
So they decide to do Paleolithic animals instead. So
that's cool.
Very cool. How about you, Brendan?
Well, I mean, really, my game design style is kind of based around it. I'm an Army brat, so I grew up moving around, and because of that, whenever I design something, I always start off with, and it's related to something you said, is what drew a community to that area, what resources, right? So I'll often ask myself questions like that, and then, you know, I go back through all the different places that I've visited, and I think about what sort of things were there and what sort of people were there. And the only reason I can draw on that is because I've been to so many different places. You know, I lived in 5 different countries, you know, for about 3 years, and so, you know, I was designing an abandoned hospital. Hospitals everybody has been in, but if you have to have been in a hospital, right, to design a hospital. You can read about them, you can learn about floor plans and things like that. But when you're able to combine experiences, right? So I visited Kos, for example. In Kos, I went to a museum dedicated to the man Hippocrates, which the Hippocratic Oath is based off of, and he had his dream temples, right? So then I was designing a hospital, and I thought about all the hospitals I went in. They had all these private rooms, and they had storage for things like medicines and bandages and stuff like that. And that's more of a modern medicine, a modern
concept.
Hospital. So I combined the concepts of Hippocrates' dream temples and the modern concept of a hospital when I was designing my post-apocalyptic Cohen Hospital, which was supposed to have existed before an apocalypse. So this was presumably what would have been a more advanced version of the ancient hospital. So it had evolved beyond just purely the Dream Temple to also involve more modern concepts in Western medicine to include, things like having laboratories for running tests and, storage for all this other stuff. And it also included, right up front, before you even got to see a doctor, a shrine to Hippocrates, full of snakes and things, where you would make your donation to the temple. So it was still a temple, but it was a full-blown hospital as well. And I was able to mesh those concepts together because I had experienced the whole dream temple concept. By the way, they're underground. They're tunnels that lead to rooms underground, and that's where you sleep.
And we actually got to visit a small subterranean dream chamber.
That's exactly right. So you dreamt, you told your doctor about it. Your doctor would be able to diagnose you based off of your dream.
It was psychiatry. It was psychiatry and medicine combined with mysticism.
Exactly. And then so in a magical world, diagnosing things through dreams becomes even more realistic. So then you combine that with surgery and modern medicines and things like that, and you get this fantastical amalgam that you wouldn't have gotten otherwise. So little pieces like that are I would say throughout all of my game development, and I don't know any other way of doing it because I've never done it any other way, but it's really enjoyable for me and then one of your players says, I see what you did there.
Right.
It's rewarding.
Excellent. How about you, Mike?
Well, I'll give the question is what specific things that have impacted our game design.
Yes, that you've discovered during field work.
Well, during field work. Okay, well, I'll give a general example and a specific example. A general example was just having been an Army infantryman for 8 years, because you just get a perspective on weapons and armor and heavy equipment that you're just not going to get through any amount of research, and honestly, that you're not going to get from owning a gun or shooting a gun. Owning a gun or shooting a gun is not the same as living with a gun, or depending on a gun, or being responsible for one, or whatever. So being an anti-tank gunner for 8 years and riding around in armored vehicles and just sort of living in muddy holes in the ground and suffering and staggering around in the snow with a gas mask on that I couldn't see out of, and being plastered on a live fire range once and almost shooting down a helicopter with an anti-tank rocket because I forgot what the sight picture of it was. I mean, this was all grist for the mill. This was all stuff that has helped me understand the universal experiences of soldiers and military people and apply that in my writing. And suffering is, as I would say, the key word. This is the key word that I would apply to the military experience on some level. So that was a general experience that has just sort of informed my writing and game development. And then a very specific thing was when I spent time exploring the catacombs under Paris. When I lived there. So this was, 25 years ago. And to a lesser extent, about 10 years ago, I went back with a friend of mine.
Yeah, that's a good spot.
It is. And it's really very telling. And it's telling for a couple of reasons. The catacombs under Paris are places where bodies are interred, where the remains of bodies are interred, but the reason those tunnels existed was because they were subterranean limestone mines, and they intersected with limestone caverns and underground lakes. So for every block of stone you see above ground in Paris, there's a space that big below ground. This is very, very a key thing to remember. So when you're walking around Paris and you see a limestone structure, every single one of those blocks was taken from the tunnels beneath the city. And then in the 1700s, the 1700s, the bodies were stacked down there. So understanding that reality of why you're going to have tunnels, why you're going to have dungeons under a city, I think that has been very helpful for me.
It is.
Actually, seeing the way the tunnels are shaped They're not 10 foot wide and 10 foot tall. They tend to be more like 5 feet wide and 8 feet tall, and then maybe 2 or 3 feet tall at the top. They're wedge-shaped tunnels so that they have more structural soundness. So just that, spending time in the catacombs, exploring the catacombs underneath the city of Paris, that has given me probably a better sense for subterranean life or culture or practices, adventuring in a dungeon-based world than just about anything.
Since you mentioned it, Mike, there was an excellent is a TED Talk by a guy who does spelunking.
Mm-hmm.
He belongs to a group of researchers that map out subterranean caverns. And I think NPR did a special on it. So for those of you who want to do some research, since so much RPG adventuring takes place underground, it's very valuable to listen to the experience of these subterranean adventurers, because they people starting to get depressed and lose all hope that they will ever see sunlight again. Stuff like that would not be something that I originally would have conceived of or have included in adventure. But if you're running, especially if you're running a game system that includes a sanity or morale mechanic,
Right.
People being underground for extended periods of time, unless they're a subterranean species like dwarves, or for example, they would probably lose their sanity or become depressed.
Yeah. Yeah, psychologically it takes a toll on you.
And then to say nothing of how that kind of messes up your body's internal rhythm, you know, and if you're lucky, your body will kind of. I've been told that when you are in an environment where there is no night and day, your body kind of falls into a 25-hour cycle. But that's assuming your body finds a cycle. Sometimes it's just complete chaos for you and everyone else involved.
Well, just responding to what Brendan was saying, and I know you still have to give your answer, Will. But responding to what Brendan was saying, experiences like Brendan and I were just describing, the subterranean experience, this actually gave me an epiphany at one point, because a lot of times in role-playing games, different races, different species are treated as essentially being only cosmetically different. So orcs are ugly humans. Dwarves are short, stout humans that are kind of grumpy and like beer. Elves are skinny humans that like whole grains. But really, you realize when you start researching stuff out, like Brendan is alluding to, and I was talking about, that biologically, fundamentally, these have to be completely different species. Dwarves would actually have different organs that allowed them to not become depressed from living underground, or to metabolize air that isn't as oxygenated as it should be, or to supplement their diets with mineral-based things. I mean, they're going to be completely different and adapted to that environment that you're finding them in, and they might not actually function like humans at all.
Oh, very good point. And then in my own experience, this was one of the best bits of field work I ever did. My old friend Brandon Petrie and I, this was shortly after we had graduated college, were looking to set up a real sort of outdoorsy live combat fantasy LARP, and there was a weekend where we just spent the whole day visiting campgrounds and other venues where we might be able to host this event. And one of the campgrounds that we checked out, while we were checking it out, we happened to notice that there was a hiking trail that connected to the area that we were considering. So we figured we would go ahead and just check out the hiking trail. And about halfway around this hiking trail, it's very well maintained, we kept noticing like these spots that would be perfect to ambush people from. And we immediately started thinking, oh, you know what we need to do? We need to set up an actual adventure for people to do. We will create a beast of burden that'll have, like we described, like we came up with like this like like this basically this like monster buffalo puppet that we wanted to build that would have like saddlebags velcroed to the side, and the idea would be we would actually position orc raiders at these ambush points, and your whole goal was to get this beast of burden all the way around the hiking trail, to represent, a trade route. But all the while, raiders would come running at you, and if they could grab one of these Velcro saddlebags and get away from you, then congratulations, that's less money you're going to get when you get to the end of the trade route. And we ended up designing this really sort of elaborate live role-play action scenario based simply because we just happened to notice these naturally occurring ambush points on a hiking trail that we just happened to find connected to a campsite we were thinking about renting for a weekend.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was a really nice discovery. Now, I'm also wondering, along those lines, what's the most interesting thing you've ever found on your field work? Clint?
Well, I'd like to think about that for a moment, but while I'm thinking, I'll talk. So
that's the Varhola way.
Hey!
One of the things that I wanted to mention was Mike mentioned going into underground sites and stuff like that. I've been to a number of 19th century mines in my day, just looking around and stuff like that on tours. And first of all, the number of places that I could stand upright without hitting my head is probably numbered on the fingers of both hands. So very rarely were they made to accommodate even a normal person with anything like headroom, let alone somebody who's over 6 feet tall like I am. And the places that were almost invariably used a mixture of tunnels that were carved and natural caverns whenever possible. So getting a whole section of 10 by 20 rooms and 10 by 10 rooms and 10 by 5 foot corridors with plenty of room to swing your polearms is really a D&D convention that doesn't exist in the real world. And that's fine if that's what you want to do, but it doesn't exist in the real world. So that's something to keep in mind. And even the places where there are headroom because of natural caverns, the tunnels between the rooms are almost always cramped little corridors that are 5 feet wide and 5 feet tall. So that's something to be aware of too. So spears and other thrusty weapons are going to be really way more popular in a situation like that than, say, great swords or long swords or that kind of thing, where you have to get some room to swing them. And I say that as somebody who knows how to swing them. So.
And little peoples are going to be the ones that function best in that environment too.
Very
for whatever
likely.
reason.
Yeah, certainly. And obviously, people that can see underground and all that kind of stuff, see in the dark and all, that's really awesome too, right? And that's a huge advantage. The other thing I wanted to mention was, Mike, you were mentioning that you served as an infantryman and stuff like that. You and I had been talking about that at Comic Palooza, and you were telling me about the amount of weight that you had to carry on a daily basis. And everybody talks about how medieval armor is so encumbering and so heavy and stuff like that. And the average amount of armor for a knight in full harness was less than the amount that you were humping along on your back.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Right? So, and it's fully distributed over your whole body, and it's fitted to you, so it works way better than any amount of shit that's hanging on in a rucksack. No matter
how those suits of armor were made by master craftsmen specifically for the people wearing them, weren't they?
Well, it depends. There's different kinds of armor, just like anything else. So you had munitions armor that was not designed for a particular person. It was essentially you bought it off the rack, and it was way cheaper, and tended not to be as good or as all-encompassing as full armor, the kind that usually shows up in museums nowadays. And those kinds of things were generally fitted to a particular individual. And of course, a lot of the ones that survived were not meant to be used at all. Not that they couldn't be used, but they were so heavily embellished, and the reason they survived is because they didn't get used. The stuff that has holes in it, they don't put on display. So
that's right.
But you're absolutely if you can get a suit of armor to stand up on its own without a person inside of it, that it's bearing a lot of its own weight.
Well, they usually have
generally
racks.
use some kind of rack to do it, but it depends on the period of armor. A lot of armor was not intended to be hung from belts and things the way that we imagine it nowadays. So it was really a system that worked exceptionally well together, and it's not the kind of thing that you can really read about or even look at for research, or even go to museums and stuff, because the armor is behind cases and they never show you the really interesting part, which is by and large the inside, because that's the part that tells you how it was worn and how it was often how it was made.
Fasteners, I always wonder about. That's the first. Whenever I see armor, like on a show, I always think, well, how is that fastened? How did they actually attach that when they put it on?
And the answer is there's a whole bunch of different ways, and they change over time, right? So it's really a question you can't really answer. There are so many different ways that it was done, but it was done intelligently because, for the most part, because the people that were buying these things and the people that were making them were the Rockefellers of the time, right? Mm-hmm. So there was plenty of money going into these harnesses. So it was very expensive stuff, and the people that made the armor were catering to people that had very informed tastes about that armor. So,
but you know, even off the shelf armor or cheaper armor, you make a good point about weight distribution. Somebody picking something up as dead weight is not the same as wearing it. I used to run with an armored vest. I used to wear an armored vest when I would go running, and that, weighed and had the bulk of, like the equivalent of like studded leather armor. And me picking it up and running with it would have been horrible. But once you're wearing it, it bears it that much more easily. And I think a lot of people who make these statements, we've got to keep in mind, people who are good at things make them look easy. And people who aren't good at a particular thing can't do them at all. And a little bit of training and a little bit of experience go a long ways. Most of these things aren't magical. They're just a matter of figuring out how to do it and doing it a few times. Yep. So,
having said that, the last thing that someone who's in full harness wants to do is sit around and wear it when they don't need to.
and that's what these idiots always want to do in their role-playing game. Well, my fighter's just going to sleep in his plate mail. Yeah, but you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't really do that.
First of all, it'd be a bit like pissing in your Jaguar, right? Because that's how much money a lot of these harnesses were worth at the time. So it's one thing to have to sleep in your car once in a while, but it's another thing to go to the toilet in it. And if you sleep in armor, it degrades over time. So
that's right.
Because you just don't rest that well.
Right. No, that's right.
The good armors are endured most easily, but it's still an endurance rather than a joy to wear.
That's right. That's right. I mean, look how happy people are to get home after a long day and just take their shoes off. Imagine if your shoes were made out of metal.
Yeah.
Metal and several layers of cloth and padding and leather straps.
Exactly.
Actually, I've got a story about field work and armor. So back in college, I had a professor, a real medieval enthusiast, Professor Hudson, and he had 2 full suits of replica medieval armor. And so as an exercise one day, we went out to Fort Pulaski, which was this old naval fort during, I think, during the Civil War. And because there's lots of natural lighting there, so we go there, and he gets 2 of the students to put on the full armor, and the idea is to just do some good live sketching of people in the armor with the natural lighting. So they each pick up a sword and kind of pantomime a sword battle. Well, while we're doing this guy from the Parks Department comes over, and we figure, oh, we have weapons, so they're going to kick us out because we're using the swords. So Hudson's talking with them back and forth. Apparently, there was nothing against having swords and armor in use at the Fort Pulaski Historical Park. But they made us put up a sign because there's so many historical society things going on. They made us put up a sign that said "Not a historical reenactment." even though you would never have medieval knights doing battle on a fort from the Civil War.
They just wanted that to be absolutely clear to everybody.
Yeah, that was their only objection. They wanted everyone to absolutely know that we were not doing some sort of historical.
It was not accurate. That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
We have a fur trade era fort here called Fort Gibraltar, which is just across the river from where I live. And we've had a number, both I've been involved in some of them, but the local LARP groups use it a lot for events. And they have the same thing there. They have signs put up at the front of the fort saying that that anybody is welcome to come in and look around, but these people that are in there are not doing anything officially sanctioned by the Fort Gibraltar Society. So, because I guess all they need is for that to hit the papers of the interwebs, right? So.
Exactly.
Maybe so. Brendan, what's the most interesting thing you've ever discovered during your field work?
I've run into a lot of interesting things. So I will mention the one that was probably most personally impactful. So when I was in Coast, Mike and I were hiking back from the ocean, and as I was walking, and this experience ended up becoming even more interesting because of a conversation we had with a local Greek woman the next day. But it was sort of in the afternoon, the sun was setting, and I'm walking, and I hear this music, and there's no rhythm to it. It's clearly not written. It sounds almost like wind chimes, but it's not as steady as wind chimes. It's a lot.
It was very pleasant, and it was pervasive. It was everywhere. Right. It was very mystical.
Coming from everywhere at once, and I couldn't see what was causing it. So it wasn't as steady as wind chimes, but it was still organic. So I had no idea what this music was coming from, and I just sort of stood there and kind of soaked it in because it was absolutely beautiful. Being on an Aegean island during the sunset, hearing this music, the temperature was just right, and then I look around and I notice that it's a bunch of goats that are just exactly hundreds of goats in the countryside with all these little silver bells that are tied to their collars, and they're the ones that are making this music. And I mean that experience was very profound, and it's not something. It doesn't sound significant. It's not something that some gung-ho fantasy designer... let me put it this way. WotC would never write about it.
But it puts a chill up the hair is standing up on the back of my neck right now, remembering that.
It was a very deep, sort of profound experience, just because of how natural it was. It was almost like the island was kind of talking to us. And the interesting thing that we ended up learning from the local Greek woman, who happened to be very well researched on ancient Greece and all of their traditions. So the word tragedy comes from the Greek word for goat song. So tragedies were these plays. It was a form of public education. So people would go to see these tragedies, and they would learn about the animalistic behavior of human beings that can cause them to go astray, right? And it's based on the word for goat song, because it's the goats singing, right, and teaching you things. And that's kind of, I guess, where the satyr animal comes from. It's part goat and part person teaching you, right? So it was interesting that those goats singing to us was such a profound experience, because it clearly was something that was significant enough to the ancient Greeks that they used the word for goat song to translate into their method of teaching the public about how to be a good or bad human being.
And in the context of the experience we had had the night before, that revelation really struck us.
Yeah.
Very nice. Well, gentlemen, I think we've had a wonderful discussion on fieldwork. But before we sign off, as always, we'll go ahead and go around and get our final thoughts. My own final thought is just to get out there, get your hands dirty, find an interesting spot, and start digging. You may find some bottle caps, or you may find a bag of marbles, or you may find a really kick-ass wolf skull that you can have hanging up in your kitchen. I'm not going to say whether or not I have that, but yes, I have that. And it's all because of fieldwork. How about you, Brendan? Your final thoughts?
Yeah, so there are a lot of abandoned places, and abandoned places, and I'm sure there are abandoned places that are near wherever you live. And the abandoned places have this habit of teaching us to look at places from a different perspective because there aren't already people showing you what everything is for. You go to a place that's inhabited, people are interacting with it in the way that it was intended. If you go to an abandoned place, it gives you a new perspective on things. It's a great way to do field work. I do recommend, though, that you go with other people. A lot of these abandoned places also tend to be not so abandoned sometimes. You might run into dogs or other things that can be dangerous. But yeah, go with your gaming group. Experience it together. You know, sometimes it's good to get out of the house. Use that time that you were going to use for a game session to go visit one of these abandoned places. Just make sure you're not breaking any laws to do it, because I don't want to get sued.
Yeah, we D-Infinity Live and our affiliate D-Infinity.net and all of our co-publishers accept no responsibility for any activities you engage in based on your listening to this show.
Right.
Mike, how about your final thoughts?
Boy, I had one, and then I started laughing, and I completely spaced it out. I would just sort of concur with everything that we've been saying. You know, I think I love gaming. I love role-playing game, and I love games. But to a large extent, gaming is vicarious adventuring for me. I would rather get out and just adventure for real all the time. But, you know, for better or worse, I've got work that I have to do, and adventuring, such as it is, takes a certain amount of resources. So I would say to people who just adventure vicariously, you know, get out in the woods, get out and do some of the kinds of things that we've been talking about, and I think that it will really enhance your at-the-table experience a lot more.
And Clint, as our special guest, you have the final thought.
Okay. Well, getting back to something that we talked about a little bit before, I would say when you get out there and you're looking around, obviously you're going to look for and you're going to see the big things. You know, the things that really stand out in an environment. But I would urge you to look for the small ones too. The little things that you can throw out as a player or as a GM to really sell the setting or your character. Like, you know, what I mentioned, the jellyfish that I saw when I was in Denmark. When I was in St. Petersburg on the same trip, I had a chance to go through the Yusupov Palace, which is like the second biggest palace and everything to the Romanovs, which were, you know, the imperial family and stuff like that. So just sickening degrees of wealth that are only really comparable to something like Versailles or that kind of thing.
Right.
And the tour that I was on was actually to go through the stages of the last 2 days of Rasputin's life. So we're going through all of these places, and the tour guides are telling us, you know, this was the place where the dinner party was held, where he was poisoned and stuff like that, and it's a fairly opulent room and that kind of stuff. And then where they take us down this little basement, and they're leading up to the place where he's shot. And I thought, oh, they're gonna find it's gonna be some kind of horrid catacomb or something like that. And I was conjuring the way that adventures are often structured, where we go through all of these rooms, and when we finally get to the end, and it's a boss encounter, and that kind of stuff. And it's at the end of the the temple room of the complex, or that kind of thing. Well, turns out I happened to be standing in the spot where Rasputin was shot when the tour guide turned to us and said, "And you're standing where he was shot," and pointed down, and there was nothing to show it, but it was just in a hallway, and the only thing to distinguish the hallway is that there was a pillar nearby. So it meant nothing. There was nothing distinguishing about it, right? So
interesting.
Shake up your gaming group by don't necessarily adhere to the tried and true encounter boss mechanic that is so prevalent. So small things and change your structure.
Excellent. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this has been another edition of D Infinity Live, and we will see you all next week for a very special episode. We are going to be doing a live game of Rogue Trader. So I think we'll all have a lot of really good time. So if you liked our live gaming Halloween episode, you are going to really get a kick out of this. So for myself, William Thrasher, for Brendan Cass, for Michael Jolly Varhola, and for Clint Staples, we have been D Infinity Live, and we will see you all next week.